everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Healthy Eating Research annual virtual grantee meeting. I'm Megan Lott, HER Deputy Director, and I'm pleased to open this year's plenary session centered on equity and research. But before I introduce the session, I'm going to kick us off with a couple of logistical reminders. So all participants are joining today in listen-only mode. If you have any questions for speakers, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're aiming to have about 30 minutes for questions and answers and facilitated discussion after our speakers give their presentations. If you have any tech or logistical questions or comments, please submit them via the Zoom chat function, and the host will get back to you as soon as possible. So in kicking off today, I wanted to just say a little bit about our goal in having these equity-centered sessions as part of each year's annual grantee meeting. And that's really to continue to give equity issues high priority and to introduce new frameworks, concepts, and tools that might help us adopt an equity lens at every stage of the research process, and thus advance efforts in the areas of nutrition, weight, and food security. We are really pleased to bring you some new perspectives this year. But first, I would like to introduce Jennifer Wubaidal, who will moderate this year's panel. Dr. Wubaidal is Florence Irving Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and inaugural Director of the Pediatric Obesity Initiative in the Department of Pediatrics at Columbia Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Wubaidal's research aims to improve child health equity with a focus on reducing racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities in obesity. Her research program translates clinical, community, and epidemiologic findings into population-level interventions during pregnancy, infancy, and early childhood to prevent childhood obesity and related chronic diseases. Jennifer has also been an extremely valuable member of HR's annual meeting planning committee this year. And so I'd like to welcome Jennifer and hand it over to her.
Thank you so much, Megan. And also thank you to Mary and the Healthy Eating Research Program, our WJF, the Meeting Planning Committee, and our panelists today for their long-standing commitments to building a research base for policy, systems, and environmental strategies that advance health equity. Yesterday's session showcased important equity-focused PSC nutrition research conducted by our WJF HER grantees. Today's session is titled Advancing Nutrition Equity, Adopting an Equity Lens at Every Stage of the Research Process. As its title underscores, today's session intentionally sets racial and ethnic health equity at the center of research and of this meeting. This is important because the purposeful application of an equity lens at the start and in each stage of research is necessary to advance equity. Eliminating racial and ethnic disparities in health and nutrition also requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about social disadvantage and hierarchies rooted in racism. The death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the stark racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 health outcomes raised public awareness about structural and institutional racism and its adverse health consequences, particularly among people of color. And with inflation, rising food prices, de-escalation of some pandemic-related food policies, extreme weather events, and other shocks and stressors to food systems, we urgently need to understand what approaches will effectively achieve food and nutrition security in an equitable manner. But structural and institutional racism are often invisible. So how can we conceptualize, understand, measure, and intervene upon an invisible enemy? Well, this session aims to address these topics from Drs. Carmen Gutierrez, Tyson Brown, and Shiriki Kumanyika. Today's panelists will highlight how structural and institutional racism cause health inequities, their connections to health via non-health policies, the conceptualization and measurement of structural racism and its effects on population health, and how researchers can advance health equity in obesity and nutrition research. With that, I am honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Carmen Gutierrez. Carmen is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Policy and a faculty fellow in the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In her research, Dr. Gutierrez examines how structural and institutional racism cause health inequalities among people in the United States. She is particularly interested in the ways that population health disparities are shaped by the US criminal legal system and the US immigration system. Dr. Gutierrez, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for organizing this event and for the audience for being here and sharing today with us. I'm really excited to be here and share my presentation on racism, health, and policy. And as Jennifer mentioned, borrowing from my expertise, I will be highlighting specifically the ways that racism and health overlap with food-related outcomes with respect to the criminal legal system and the immigration system in the United States. So just to orient us around an understanding of racism, as you all likely know, racism is a multifaceted and complex phenomenon that ranges from interpersonal individual interactions all the way up through macro level systems of societies. And today I will be focusing on the institutional and structural aspects of racism and how they relate to health inequalities and specific to the US criminal legal system and immigration system. And just to clarify, institutional racism can be understood as the policies and programs that are embedded within systems and institutions in society that themselves sort of reify and establish racial discrimination and racism. And structural racism can more broadly be understood as the totality of ways that systems and institutions are self-reinforcing and establish and reinforce racism in society. So as I mentioned, I'm going to walk us through two examples, and the first being the US criminal legal system. So in case it's useful, I want to first provide some background information on the US criminal legal system. I know folks today are researchers with all sorts of backgrounds, so I don't want to assume that anyone, has any particular, specific knowledge on this. So let me please give us some helpful information to start. So in case it's useful to know, the US criminal legal system, like many features of the United States, is exceptional. And it's exceptional with respect to its historical and comparative features. So from a historical standpoint, the United States incarcerates more people today than it ever has in the history of the contemporary forms of punishment that we have. So as you can see here, from the early 1900s onward, there was a rather, unremarkable level of incarceration with respect to the number of people in jails and prisons in the United States until around the mid-1970s, when the level of punishment skyrocketed with what became known today as mass incarceration. And starting in the mid-2000s, and what we still see today is a number that I want you to know if you're not familiar yet, which is this 1 in 100. So nowadays, approximately 1 in 100 adults are behind bars on any given day in the United States, either in jail or prison. So that's about 1% of the population, again, who experience the most extreme form of punishment in jail or prison. And from a comparative standpoint, with about 2.2 or so million people in jail and prison on any given day, we in the United States incarcerate more people than comparatively any other country. And so while, the US makes up only about 5% of the world's population, we're responsible for about 20% of the global incarcerated population. And incarceration, I want to just emphasize, is only one piece of the broader US criminal legal system puzzle. About 2.2 million people are incarcerated in jail or prison, but an additional 4 to 5 million people on any given day are under some other form of criminal legal surveillance. Perhaps in the community, something that might be familiar would be something like probation or parole. So the reach of the criminal legal system is massive. And so I mentioned the 1 in 100 number. And when we account for other people who are involved in the system through community supervision like probation and parole, that 1 in 100 number goes to reach about 1 in 40 adults on any given day. So also the 1 in 100 and 1 in 40 numbers, as you might have guessed, are not equally distributed in society. Rather, the likelihood of being involved in the criminal legal system is deeply concentrated among certain groups of the population. Punishment is a rather racialized phenomenon and also gendered phenomenon. So men are more likely to experience punishment through jail and prison or probation and parole than women, and Black and brown folks are more likely to experience punishment than their white counterparts, with Black men being the most likely than any other race sex group to experience time in jail or prison than any other subpopulation. So with respect to the massive scale of punishment in the US criminal legal system, the fact that it's a relatively new historical phenomenon and it's so comparatively unique, researchers for the last few decades have begun to understand incarceration as its own form of stratification. And we have come to learn that incarceration has sort of causal impacts on folks' outcomes across domains in society. One domain being the labor market, with people who've been incarcerated experiencing lower wages, working fewer weeks in a year, and also earning less annually than people who have not been to jail or prison. And we also know that people who have spent time in jail or prison, once they've returned to society, often experience worse health across the life course, and they experience worse health with respect to physical, chronic diseases, as well as mental illness, as well as disabilities. And so again, this is an effect that we have come to isolate that is associated with their incarceration. So as I've sort of summarized from the previous slides, we know that incarceration has a direct impact on someone's socioeconomic status. As I mentioned, it negatively impacts people's outcomes in the labor market. Incarceration also impacts someone's psychological well-being or mental health, and it also impacts their physical well-being or physical ability. In addition, incarceration can impact several other domains in someone's life, including just a few others named here, including housing or someone's neighborhood attainment, whether or not they're able to receive public assistance, and also their social ties. And together, as you all, as health researchers and food-related outcome researchers know, these social outcomes themselves then have an impact on someone's food security, or food insecurity rather, and as well as their access to healthy food and healthy food environments. So there's a complex direct and indirect link between incarceration and food-related outcomes. So just to summarize, in the literature, what we know in terms of the relationship between the criminal legal system and food-related outcomes, what we've observed in the literature is that people who've been to jail or prison often experience increased risk for becoming overweight or obese during their detention, as well as after their release. people who experience incarceration across their lifetime experience a higher prevalence of obesity-related diseases, including diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. And as a result of other mechanisms like socioeconomic status and social welfare programs, people who've been to jail and prison also experience a much greater likelihood of food insecurity and hunger. And these outcomes are not, in a vacuum to just those individuals. They spill over to families and communities as well. And so in the literature, we've also found that people who have a family member who's incarcerated, including the children of incarcerated parents, also are more likely to experience food insecurity. Food insecurity can also exist for infants, given that pregnant mothers who are exposed to incarceration either directly themselves or vicariously through a partner experience food insecurity and worse birth outcomes as a result. Also, among children of incarcerated parents, we observe increased prevalence of overweight and obesity across time. And as well as among family members, we observe higher rates of obesity-related illnesses. And I just want to emphasize this other link with public assistance benefits. So during incarceration, we observe that once people become incarcerated, they lose their access to benefits like Medicaid, food assistance, cash assistance, Social Security, and public housing. And those benefits, some of them can be reaffirmed, or someone can become re-eligible once they are released into society. But for some people, there's a lifetime ban. And those lifetime bans include assistance for food assistance and cash assistance, and often for public housing. And so what I think are really interesting and important directions for future research in this area are for folks to investigate more the impact of social welfare programs on food insecurity. So I mentioned cash assistance and food assistance specifically, but we also know that people who become incarcerated may have worse access to something like Medicaid more generally. And so, that could also have an impact. It's also important that we collect more data on the relationship between food-related outcomes and people who experience punishment through the criminal legal system. So an effort to collect longitudinal data is important. Also, I think it would be interesting and important for folks to investigate food insecurity with respect to COVID-19. And I would love to talk more about this, but I'm going to continue going to the next example in the interest of time. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief now overview of my second example on the immigration system. So the immigration system, to give you a background on the immigration system, the number of the number of people in the United States who are foreign born has reached a peak in recent years. Around 14% or so of the US population is now foreign born. Approximately 1/4 of folks who are foreign born in the United States are unauthorized or undocumented. And the majority of folks who are unauthorized in the United States are from Latin American countries, including Mexico and other Northern Triangle countries of Central America. And as you know, probably, we're all most familiar with immigration policy since Trump's presidency, that there's been, more of a focus on punitive measures for surveillance on people who are undocumented. And I would love to talk during the Q&A more about the types of immigration policies that have come up. But just to give you a sense that there are lots of immigration policies that now criminalize someone's immigration status, such that being undocumented is in and of itself a criminal offense. And researchers have begun to investigate the ways that this new immigration environment has led to stress and has harmed the well-being of not only immigrants, but also their families and communities. And one area of research has investigated how immigration policies have related to worse outcomes for mothers and infants. We've also seen that harsh immigration policy has gotten in the way of folks' access to healthcare. And specifically, as I think I implied with the demographic composition of undocumented immigrants, this is often a racialized phenomenon specific to not just the broader Latinx population, but specifically those who are Mexican or Central American, or who might even just look like they are, right? And again, so related to this work, there's also been a few studies relating harsh immigration policy context on food insecurity. And so what we are seeing in this food-related literatures is that people who are, affected by harsh immigration policy have, worse outcomes with respect to their food security. And overwhelmingly, folks who are undocumented immigrants are experiencing worse health outcomes and worse obesity-related health outcomes over time. And also, again, similar to what I mentioned with respect to the criminal legal system, these outcomes spill over to children and families, sort of regardless of their immigration status. I think there's a lot of needs for future research in this specific area, because specifically harsh immigration policies and food-related outcomes have gotten not a ton of attention. So here are a few examples of the ways that I think we as researchers can dig more into this area specifically. And with that, I will close, and I look forward to everyone's questions. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gutierrez. We look forward to discussing questions at the end of this session. For anyone who's just joined, please don't forget to enter any of your questions for discussion later on at the end of this session. You can use the Q&A below. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Tyson Brown. Tyson is an associate professor of sociology at Duke University, where he directs the Center on Health and Society. His research examines the who, when, and how questions regarding ethno-racial inequalities in health. Dr. Brown's current research focuses on developing novel approaches to measuring structural racism across societal domains and quantifying structural racism's health effects, with the goal of providing knowledge to achieve health equity and improve population health. Welcome, Dr. Brown. We look forward to your discussion.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you all inviting me to present today, and I'm excited to share my research on novel approaches to measuring structural racism with the hope that it'll be useful for advancing health equity research, or rather healthy eating research. And I'd like to just begin by zooming out to give an overview of trends in research on race and health, with special attention to where we've been, where we are, and where we should go. And while much of my discussion today will focus on health writ large, the overarching ideas and opportunities for research apply to healthy eating research as well. And obviously, we've gained a lot of important foundational information about racial inequities in health from descriptive studies, and I think that also applies to healthy eating research. And fortunately, the field has largely moved beyond discredited biological and cultural deficit explanations. And this is encouraging because there's really no good evidence of a genetic basis for broad-based racial disparities in morbidity and mortality, which makes sense when you think about it, given that there is 9 times more genetic variation within racial groups than there is between racial groups. And if for folks who are interested in this particular topic, I would encourage you to look at the work of Duke professor Charmaine Royal, as well as Alondra Nelson at Princeton, as well as Dorothy Roberts at Penn, among a number of other scholars. We've also seen the limited utility of behavioral human capital and behavioral human capital explanations for racial inequities. Oftentimes, residual racial disparities after accounting for health behaviors and SES are attributed to discrimination. And yet these approaches operate under an untenable assumption that racism does not shape behaviors in the acquisition of socioeconomic resources in the first place. So it's becoming more and more clear that focusing solely on individual level behavioral economic factors leads to an incomplete and biased understanding of the drivers of racial inequities in health and healthy eating. Scholars are increasingly conceptualizing racial inequities as a consequence of structural racism. And yet, relatively few studies have empirically tested this proposition. And skeptics point to the dearth of quantitative research on the relationship between structural racism and health or healthy eating. And they dismiss structural racism as a slippery concept for which robust empirical evidence documenting its effects is lacking. So as a field, we really have an opportunity to gain traction by actually measuring structural racism and its effects on health. And this will enable us to do a couple of things. First, to answer new, salient, and innovative questions. Second, to employ more rigorous research designs. And then third, to build a knowledge base to inform efficacious racial equity solutions. And despite the centrality of structural explanations for understanding racialized inequality, less than 1% of the studies on the link between race and health have focused on structural racism. So this is a really a wide chasm. If we think that this is really where the action is and possibly sort of the smoking gun or the primary explanation, and yet very little of our empirical studies have actually tested these propositions. So to better understand the role of structural racism in shaping health, I'll outline several research priorities that I think will really move the field forward. And the first is that we should utilize core tenets of structural theories to guide our measurement approaches, right? And so the idea is that there's a lot of great information out there. We need to pull it together and then use that to inform our measurement approaches. And then second, we should really develop novel theory-informed multi-sectoral measures of structural racism. Third, by mapping structural racism, we'll gain a better understanding of the geographic variation in racial exclusion and subordination to sort of give us heat maps, if you will, of particularly hotspots, if you will. And then fourth, we should estimate the impact of structural racism on racialized health patterns by linking contextual structural racism measures with geocoded data on health and demographics and healthy eating. And then fifth, we really need to lower the barrier to this type of research by building a publicly available data infrastructure of measures of structural racism to catalyze research on the structural determinants of health and healthy eating. So my talk today, given, I've got 15 minutes, so my talk today is going to zero in on a couple things. Primarily, I'll be talking about utilizing core tenets to build measurements, and then also developing novel measures of structural racism, and then also estimating the association between structural racism and health as sort of a proof of concept. And I'm happy to discuss some of the other topics during the Q&A. So scholars will admit that there are many challenges to measuring structural racism because it's a complex and insidious de facto phenomena that is often hidden or not directly observed. And I think that Dr. Gutierrez's discussion really laid that out nicely in her previous talk. And so it's not surprising that there are relatively few empirical studies that explicitly measure it. So my colleague Patricia Holman and I have a study under review that scopes the broader literature to identify central tenets of structural racism theories to understand the complexity of structural racism. And we build upon prior theoretical innovations by distilling foundational ideas of structural racism in the literature to generate a definition that provides conceptual and also analytical clarity on its nature and impact. So we posit that structural racism involves a multifaceted, interconnected, and institutionalized system of relational subordination for people of color and superordination for whites that is observable as manifest racial inequalities in life outcomes. So in short, structural racism refers to the systemic racial exclusion from power, resources, opportunities, and well-being. We can also add healthy eating. And structural racism is embedded in major political, economic, medical, criminal, legal, and social institutions. And as I mentioned before, it's observable as racial inequalities in things like education, occupations, wages, wealth, health, political representation, incarceration, housing, and also opportunities for healthy eating. So structural racism is considered a fundamental cause driving racial inequities because it shapes the whole constellation of more immediate health risks and health promoting resources, such as healthy foods, that individuals are exposed to. So structural racism can affect health through many, many different intervening mechanisms, which I'm also happy to discuss during the Q&A. So thinking about the literature that's out there, empirical studies on structural racism are often out of step with theoretical insights that have tended to be limited in a couple of respects. So for example, studies have often relied on single indicators of structural racism, which are really useful, but at the same time, they can be subject to measurement error. Or they've examined several indicators, but looked at them separately, overlooking relationships among structural forms of racism and how they operate as a system and jointly shape health or healthy eating. And not only do these approaches fail to capture the extent to which indicators of structural racism are interconnected and reflect an underlying latent construct, but they also lead to an incomplete understanding and possibly biased estimates of the impact of structural racism on racial inequity. Furthermore, much of the research on much of the structural racism measurement has been at the meso level, such as neighborhoods and counties, which are really important, but this is largely overlooked more macro level contexts, such as states, which is what I'm focusing on today. So after immersing myself in the literature for several years, I was surprised to find these really huge gaps in the literature. So there are a lot of questions that remain as to how to best measure structural racism and its impact on health. So I'm currently working on a project that aims to address several of these questions, two of which I'm going to discuss today. And the first is, does state-level structural racism across societal domains reflect an underlying latent construct? And of course, latent constructs are phenomena that are not directly observed. And is structural racism associated with worse health outcomes for Blacks and whites? So I'm going to skip over the data and the methods for the sake of concision, but I'm happy to come back to them. I will just briefly show this table of each of the domains of indicators of structural racism that I examined. And I'll mention that we use publicly available data to examine structural racism for the year 2010, spanning these 5 domains: the judicial system, education, economic resources, political participation, and also residential segregation. And the measurement approaches here are informed by theoretical perspectives, as well as previously validated measures of state-level structural racism. So the next step is to test whether state-level structural racism reflects an underlying latent construct. And we're especially interested in measuring structural racism in ways that are in line with structural theories. And a latent variable approach is well suited for minimizing measurement error and capturing conceptual properties of a complex system that's often difficult to quantify or directly measure, such as structural racism. And so along those lines, the 9 indicators of structural racism that I mentioned on the previous slide were used to develop a latent measure of structural racism. We use confirmatory factor analysis to measure the extent to which structural racism across domains are reflective of this underlying construct. And we systematically evaluated model fit using varying model specifications related to correlated errors and also dimensionality. And all considered the CFA measurement model that specifies a single dimension and allows for common sources of variance in the indicators that are largely conceptually motivated, has a good fit with the data, and generates reasonable parameter estimates. So here, building on the previous slide, this figure illustrates the factor structure of the latent construct of structural racism. And these correlated errors are all intended to address common sources of variation that are independent of the effect of structural racism on the various indicators. And taken together, the various statistics show that these indicators reflect an underlying latent construct. So this is fairly strong evidence for the existence of this thing out there in the ether called structural racism. So we're excited that we're able to identify this model. But the next step is to then address the second question, which is, how does structural racism shape health among Blacks and whites? So for that, I used data from the Health and Retirement Study, so the gold standard for health data among adults over the age of 50. And I also used data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which is the largest nationally representative health survey in the US. I look at 5 different health outcomes that are listed here, and I include a number of controls that are also listed. I'd like to just go ahead and skip to the results, but I'm happy to talk about control measures that we included. So here we see that there's a remarkably consistent pattern across all 4 health outcomes, including self-rated health, body mass index, functional limitations, and depressive symptoms. And in every instance, exposure to greater levels of structural racism leads to worse health among Black people. And each of these relationships is statistically significant. We do not find a statistically significant relationship between structural racism and health for white people. And I'll mention that these results are multivariate regression analyses that adjust for a number of factors. And so we were pretty confident about those findings, but we wanted to we wanted to replicate it in a different data set. So we started looking at the BRFSS, and we looked at several health outcomes, including self-rated health and poor mental health days. And as you can see, once again, we find that structural racism is harmful for the health of Blacks. And this was true for both self-rated health and number of poor mental health days, but that's not the case for whites. And in fact, results show that higher levels of structural racism are predictive of better health, mental health for whites, which is in line with sort of a zero-sum or conflict perspective. And so, I view this as an early study in a nascent but growing field. And I'd like to share what I think are a few key take-home points before pivoting to talk about future directions. And first, the key tenets of structural racism are useful for informing measurement strategies. Second, consistent with the notion that racism involves a multifaceted, interconnected, and institutionalized system, we find that indicators of structural racism do in fact reflect an underlying latent construct. And more broadly, findings highlight the utility of ecosocial theories focus on the contingent health consequences of macro-level discriminatory environments. The study also contributes to the literature by demonstrating the importance of studying states to understand health inequalities, and we conceptualize states as racializing institutional actors that shape population health. There are a lot of exciting opportunities for future research. I've got a minute left, so I'm gonna try to breeze through this. But a couple ideas would be that future studies should really use longitudinal data to better understand the temporal dimensions of this relationship, such as the potential impacts of sensitive periods, durations of exposure, and lagged effects. I'm interested in examining the intersection of multiple levels of racism as well, looking at the macro, meso, and also micro. And finally, we need a better understanding of the health consequences of multiple forms of racism, including historical, cultural, and legal forms. And I'll just put this plug in here for thinking about other sources of novel data. Think about historical racial violence. Here are a few maps that I think are useful. And also thinking about sort of contemporary cultural and ideological forms of racism that can be integrated into research on healthy eating. And I am out of time, so I will go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. We look forward to discussing further at the end of the session. And now it is my delight to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Shiriki Kumanyika. Shiriki is a research professor at the Drexel University Dornsife School of Public Health and Professor Emerita of Epidemiology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Kumanyika's research is related to obesity, sodium intake, diet and lifestyle, and chronic disease risk reduction. Her recent research has focused on identifying ways to combat the effects of racialized, targeted marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages on food-related attitudes and practices of Black Americans. She has also developed frameworks to inform equity-focused obesity and nutrition interventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I am really pleased to be the sort of wrap up for this particular session, especially because I think it establishes a new approach in our food and nutrition field, and obesity prevention field, to really giving social determinants their just due, so to speak, to taking a deep dive into what these determinants are and the many, many pathways, as you've seen, whereby they can affect the outcomes that we are particularly interested in. The remarks I'm going to make are based on a forthcoming paper that's will be in the Annual Review of Nutrition. I think it will be out by the end of the month, at least online, and then published later, formally later in the year. And that paper includes a lot of background on some of the topics that you've been hearing about. I also mentioned the NIMHD framework from NIH, which guides a lot of research and which establishes the legitimacy of looking at structural issues in health research at all levels and all types of research. And I also go into some definitions just very briefly about these issues that we've been talking about, definitions of equity, what structural racism is, and so forth. I'm not going to repeat that background in this talk, And if I can go to the next slide, I'm going to really focus on what I see as the challenge and the opportunity of this moment that we're in looking at equity issues. Next slide. The challenges I see, the four here, I think are the major challenges. One is that prevalence is still increasing in the US and worldwide. And that means that the absolute levels, the absolute numbers of people with obesity is still going up in adults and children. And that also, because some of the solutions that we have are not really reaching all populations equitably, some of the gaps are even widening, so that those absolute levels are going to be higher in populations like Black women, for example. The situation is complicated by the COVID pandemic in many ways that you've seen and heard about, aggravated in terms of weight gain and other disease profiles related to obesity, but also just in terms of the difficulty of putting solutions into place, even the ones that we think that work. So the pathway to sustainable solutions is not clear. Next. However, there are opportunities hidden in some of the things that have happened. The NIH call to action to end structural racism has a lot of energy, was unexpected, I think, from those of us who had seen the less political face of NIH for many decades. But this is now more than a political issue. It is a political issue with direct impact on health. And so NIH has stepped up with this Unite initiative and so forth to really encourage, as a call to action, tackling structural racism. We have quite a bit of momentum on obesity-related policy systems and environmental change. Even if those things are not converging, we know a lot about what can work and what and how it can be improved within that domain to converge with other types of solutions. The racial reckoning and the building momentum on anti-racist praxis is another positive development and opportunity. And finally, and I'll mention this later, the increasing appreciation of the role of implementation science. So next, I'll talk about the recommendations. Next. Here are the 5 complementary approaches to changing the course that I thought about after doing the analysis of where we are in terms of progress, what's working, what's not working. The Changing the Course, it was the subtitle of the paper I was asked to write, the one that's going to be in the Annual Review of Nutrition, and that was the most challenging part. So how do we make sure that we do better and advance progress in this equity area? So here are the 5 recommendations, and I'll go over each one. They're numbered in the article, and they have an order in this diagram, but they're really all equally important, and they reinforce each other. So one, giving equity issues higher priority, adopt a health equity lens, which is the topic of this entire session, strengthen approaches by using health equity frameworks, broaden the types of policies considered relevant to obesity, and you've heard a lot about those policies already, and then emphasize implementation science concepts and tools. Next, so I'll start with the first one, give equity issues higher priority. Intentionality is essential. There are 2 elements here. One is that in order to know if solutions work in priority populations for equity work, the people have to be engaged in the study or in the practice. So giving priority drives inclusiveness, inclusion. And if you look in the research literature, the number and inclusiveness of priority populations in trials is so small as to say it's almost inconsequential. The intention has to be there, because if not, there will be either a too low number of people to really look to see if something is working in a particular subgroup. It has to be in the planning, the recruitment and the setting. NIH guidelines actually say that they require for clinical trials analyses of whether results differ by the priority population subgroups. Ideally, those analyses by subgroups would be informative, which means there would be a large enough sample size to tell whether there's a significant difference. And that means that inclusion must go beyond the proportion of a group in the overall population, like in the census. So Black population is 12 or 13% of the census. That may not be enough to get you a subgroup, especially in a smaller study, that you can really draw any conclusions about. And I have some sources here on this slide of papers where this has been studied for different types of studies. So people have to be there, have to be engaged. And then on the next slide, the other element is that inclusion is not enough. The intentionality goes through to making sure that what's being done fits the population and the context. We've seen examples of insufficient attention to equity where gaps have actually widened because it worked well for those who could afford or were in the situation to have it work, and not so well for those who didn't have that same context. I think we can assume that even the most well-designed policy or program is going to work differently in different circumstances, and that some targeting to different contexts or tailoring to different individuals will also be necessary. The definitions here are from the, I think, well-known Kruder et al. Paper from 2003 of differentiating, targeting, and tailoring. And the reason I included it here is that we have this concept of universal interventions, which, well, we don't need to tailor it because it's good for everybody. And then we have trials, even those targeted to a particular population. Well, I'm only going to recruit African Americans, and so therefore I don't need to do anything else. Both of those are false assumptions, and I have these definitions here that you can read when the slides are distributed. But to say that always accommodations have to be made within a large population or within even a already targeted population. Next. The second recommendation is to adopt a health equity lens, which will be no surprise to this audience because of this session. I have two definitions here. One that I developed, an equity lens is a set of field glasses that allows one to see both overt and subtle injustices at work, and to reject biases and stereotypes that blame people for circumstances that are beyond their control. And I always like to think of this as really a process of continually, we all are in a process of continually focusing our lens to see more and more of these things that maybe were not a part of our experience or that we take for granted as the way things are. And then there's another definition there about understanding the social political context as well. A health equity lens drives the motivation and informs the capacity for intentionality. So if you see the population and the circumstances, then the intention to recruit population into your study and or practice, and you have the qualifications to actually adapt the intervention so that it fits the context. Next. There are lots of elements of a health equity lens. I think we've already had a good discussion of what some of those are from the prior speakers, so I won't go into this list, but I do want to point out the issue of intersectionality of identities that determine the way a person is viewed and treated in society. Who has power and how do people react to power, and grounding considerations of race within historical and cumulative life course influences. And you see an NIH framework, you see the life course, but there's not enough attention paid to differences in life course, I think, by different populations. And that's been termed dimensionality by Vijaya Hogan in papers from one of their equity frameworks, and Diane Rowley, and community engagement, of course. Next. Third recommendation, and if I had to pick one to say it's the most important in moving us forward, it would be this one: strengthen approaches by using health equity frameworks. And this is because, fortunately, there is a very well-developed field of health equity science. Social scientists have really dug into this, specified the different elements. You've heard excellent presentations about that just prior. And I think that when focusing on our outcomes, we run the risk of underspecifying the actual role of the health social determinants, unless we're really using a framework where health equity is the primary focus, not necessarily through the narrow disease outcome lens. So it can help guide hypotheses, operationalize the pathways, build the political will for societal change, because the things that need to be changed are often not health outcomes directly, they are the societal outcomes, like the criminal legal system, as you've heard. Also, health equity frameworks can lead to synergy, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you can invent it together. If you could fix some of these systems, it would affect a lot of different health outcomes, and so it sort of fosters collaboration. Next. And this is just a list of some of the types of frameworks that have been developed. I have, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 references in the paper for different health equity frameworks, including one that helps to integrate health equity considerations into behavioral interventions, which are still the focus that I think a lot of people are thinking that the answer is there in the behavioral interventions. So I won't dwell on these, but just so you know, they're policy analysis frameworks and a lot of other ones. Next. There are also frameworks that have pulled in equity concepts with an obesity or a health care focus, and I've had this slide and the next one lists 6 of these. I've been involved in developing 2 of these, and so just to say that it's complementary, you don't give up the frameworks that have focused on the specific content, but you really blend them and prioritize some of the core health equity frameworks. So you can go skip the next one in the interest of time, and then next. Fourth, broaden the types of policies considered relevant to obesity because they affect obesity through social determinants. And this is an appeal for evidence on the effectiveness of structural interventions, or what some authors have called disease agnostic or inclusive interventions that focus on the social determinants. And here's some of the policies, and you heard again from the prior speakers about how important it is to look at these other policies that affect individual and family life. Next. And this is the last recommendation about implementation science, concepts and tools. It's really fortunate that implementation science has had really come much more to the fore of our awareness. It saves us from being locked in to strict fidelity to evidence-based interventions that have been developed, in situations and circumstances, and with sets of people who really are not representative of people in the real world. So I'm listing some of the advantages of using implementation science. And here again, the people in this field have developed so many tools and concepts and frameworks that we can use for our work. So we don't have to invent these, they are readily applicable. So I'm going to move to my last slide. I think I have less than a minute left. I think some next steps for us are listed here. One is, let's think about a new baseline. Okay, so where are we? A lot of things have happened. We've been trying to work on this for a long time. So let's do an assessment, a situation analysis, and figure where we're starting on the trajectory. I think the future considerations can build on what we've already figured out. And I've listed some of these things here where there's evidence for effectiveness. And we can also look at the new policy climate for equity research in light of the changes that were made, accommodations made in relation to COVID, and use that to support natural experiments and observational studies about other types of solutions. And then finally, because obesity is one of 3 major pandemics that have some common drivers, look for synergies with other things, other reasons to do things that will also help obesity or undernutrition. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Shiriki. Please stay on the line, so to speak, as we are now moving into the question and answer discussion portion. So we'll go ahead and invite Tyson and Carmen back on. Thank you all so much to think about, and really brilliant presentations. A lot of questions coming in through the chat and the Q&A. I know you answered some of them, but I did want to start off by highlighting one question that you had answered, Carmen, regarding a question on whether the impacts of incarceration on individual and family health are because of lower wages or if they're independent of them.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Tyson and Shiriki, for your talks as well. I've been learning a lot today. And so to answer this question, yeah, it's a really good, important question because, I think especially with the model that I showed, that incarceration has sort of these direct impacts on things like labor market outcomes. But the research that has been going on now for the last 2 decades or so, looking at health and incarceration, has found independent impacts of incarceration on health. So controlling for all these factors, we still are seeing a unique, independent, and significant relationship, which is pretty profound considering that incarceration has all these direct impacts on factors that can themselves relate to health. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Similar kind of in that line of questioning, Shiriki, you discussed racial patterns of obesity. To what extent are they related to socioeconomic differences?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and it is definitely related. Because the mechanism for some of these factors are stressors that we don't have good ways to measure yet. And so it really points out the measurement issue of getting into the nuances. And in the case of your question, this brings up intersectionality because race and gender, Black women, if I look at myself, I'm an older woman raised in the South with a PhD, and Black and living in a segregated environment at first. And it always influences the way I respond to power. I was taught to hold my head down, so all of these things come together when you start looking at the stressors and the screens, the filters that people have. The evidence for this, and I did have a chance to mention this in the forthcoming paper, is that the disparities in obesity in Black women are largest in the higher education and income groups. So it's been called, from a theoretical perspective, diminishing returns. So it's the opposite to what you would expect. The rates are the same across the education income levels. Maybe they go down a little bit with college education. But what you see is that you can't predict what's going to happen because of socioeconomic status, because it doesn't buy you out of all those other statistics that you've seen from Carmen, for example. That's, everybody, they may have relatives, the 1 in 100. People may have more likely to have relatives if they're in a particular, racial ethnic group. So I think that's a really good question. People think you can control for that and it wipes it out, but that's actually opposite to the case.
Thank you. I think, Tyson, you talked about intersectionality in your presentation. Can you elaborate a little bit on the nuances and limitations to the available measurement tools and the data that's available for studying the intersectionality in structural racism and these other topics that Shiriki just touched on?
Absolutely. I'm glad we're talking about this because I think this is, really important. A lot of my earlier work was focused on intersectionality. So I'm a co-author of a paper that was published last year. The lead author is Patricia Homan, me, and then also Brittany King. And it takes a structural approach to intersectionality. Historically, the work on intersectionality and health has looked at individual level statuses, right? So looking at an individual's race, their gender, their sexuality, their perhaps disability status, ableism, economic factors, those sorts of things. And that's really important. But the theory also points to these upstream macro level factors, these sort of interconnecting sources of oppression, if you will, right? And so we wanted to take a more structural approach and think about it from that perspective. So drawing on conceptualizations in the literature to inform measurement strategies. So much like the presentation I gave a few minutes ago on structural racism, we also included measures of structural sexism that Patricia Homan developed in her own research. And we incorporated the structural racism measures with that and also indicators of economic inequality, mainly the Gini coefficient. And so we did this again at the state level. And we wanted to see, what is the relationship between structural racism, structural sexism, and economic inequality at the macro level? And, somewhat surprisingly, I think to many folks, is that there was either a very weak relationship or sometimes a negative relationship in some instances. And so while these things are certainly interrelated, they're also distinct. And so I think this really, really illustrated the importance of thinking deeply about these things and thinking about how they might combine and then also linking them to outcomes. And so in that study, we did link it to individual level health outcomes. So state level structural racism, structural sexism, economic inequality, geocoded link to health outcomes in the BRFSS. And we found that, that these forms of oppression did in fact jointly shape health outcomes. So the basic patterns that states with greater levels of inequality or oppression in those different domains tended to produce worse health outcomes across the board, but primarily for Black people and especially for Black women. And so the strongest relationship between forms of structural intersectionality were among Black women, Black men, followed by white women, and then very few effects among white men. And so it's really, I will confess that this is a very complicated area of study, and it's really not much is out there taking a structural approach to intersectionality. And after doing that study, I now understand why. But I think that there's a ton of work to be done in that space. And I encourage folks to jump in. I'm happy to talk with folks that are interested in doing that. If you're thinking about a topic for your dissertation, perhaps, I think that that article, the Homan, Brown, and King in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, may be a useful resource.
Thank you. Kind of keeping along this idea of measurement, Carmen, you spoke about WIC-SNAP, other kind of benefits, enrollments, barriers among immigrants that were recently exacerbated by like a chilling effect in the context of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. But we know that things like SNAP and other benefits programs have clear evidence to promote food and nutrition security in populations that have health disparities. So enrollment in these programs is important, but as you pointed out, finding kind of timely, publicly available data that includes information on enrollment and immigration status over time among families can be challenging. So for the researchers and the audience who are collecting data, what are some of the key research questions about immigration that they should consistently include in their nutrition equity research?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Jennifer. It's a really important, timely question. And I think especially for immigration research and thinking about immigration status and as it relates to any outcome, but especially with respect to public benefits, we have to be very careful and responsible here, right? So I think this is a tricky area to navigate. I think that, an approach that obviously offers confidentiality and anonymity is important, a safe space for people to feel comfortable providing information that cannot be linked back to them is going to be extremely important. And in terms of questions, I think that if researchers can, ethically offer participants the opportunity to share their immigration status, that would be extremely important. I also think that it's important for us to think about the Latinx population or to recognize that it's an extremely heterogeneous population. So I think that if we can dig further and think about asking folks, about their country of origin specifically, I tried to mention that, the impact of harsh immigration environments are not equal among all Latinx people. It tends to be specific among people who are Mexican or from other Northern Central American countries. So I think asking about country of origin, also asking about potentially ancestry more broadly. There's reasons to think that people who have more indigenous backgrounds may be at greater disadvantages than those who are more European, even though they may all be, from Mexico. There's a mix of folks in their ancestry background. Language and language information is really important, again, for this population that's very heterogeneous. And I think with respect to policies and access to programs among Latinx people right now, I would be asking questions about public charge and the public charge policy that's just sort of, it's an evolving landscape really for people, and what their knowledge is, what their perceptions are, how they feel it's impacting not only themselves, but also, there are lots of mixed status families out there. And so we should be asking about whether and to what extent this is having spillover effects onto, children and families as well.
Thank you. I'm going to move more into kind of a conversation about policy change. Tyson, I'm going to start with you. You at the end of your talk, you pointed out the importance of addressing upstream determinants of health through economic and social policy change to reduce structural racism and improve health equity. But if a policy, systems, or environmental change, improved or worsened structural racism, what would be a realistic timescale, given kind of the available, data and the complicated manner in examining structural racism? When would you really realistically expect to be able to see that change, measure that change?
Jennifer, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if there were actually changes implemented, what would be a lag time between that policy shift to seeing a downstream improvement in health outcomes for minoritized populations?
Exactly. Considering from a measurement perspective, if overnight, major change, major improvement with the data that's available, realistically from a researcher's perspective, when can they, expect to see these changes?
Well, as a scholar, I don't like going off script without my data, but I will kind of speculate a bit, I suppose. This is why we need longitudinal data. This is why we need more folks doing this type of research. This is why we need folks looking at policy context. There's a wonderful, I want to just mention, this is related, I promise. There's a wonderful article that came out last year led by Medina Agenor. And what she and her colleagues did was they provided a database on structural racism in, I believe, 13 domains, including 843 different laws. And I think that's a great resource that we could really plumb to address some of these these questions, right? Because some of the policies and contexts that are included in that database go back a ways. And so we can look retrospectively. Of course, prospectively, we'll see. I think that we need more research in this area. It's really in its infancy. Almost all the work that's quantitative and rigorous has been cross-sectional, and my team and a number of others are working to sort of fill that gap and implement more of a life course perspective, because I think we all recognize that in fact temporality does matter. It does matter, when you're exposed to these scenarios, how long you're exposed to them, and if there might be lags. And so I think that last point relates to your question. My first answer is I don't know, but I think that there likely would be a lag. At the same time, we might see some pretty, a fairly quick sort of returns on investments if we're able to actually shift policy. And I think we can point to some studies that showed relatively quick impacts of civil rights legislation that was passed in the 60s that led to improvements in Black health writ large, including infant mortality, just half a decade later. So in the early 70s, mid 70s, we saw some real improvements based on the gains that African Americans were making, whether it be in terms of education, housing, voting rights. In a number of respects, we actually saw improvements in health. Of course, that was reversed due to a number of the policies that were implemented primarily in the 1980s. But we have seen evidence that these things can actually move. And I think it's really helpful to recognize that they are not natural, they're not immutable, but these things are salient. These things are, they couldn't be tractable. And just as policies and practices have led to these inequalities in an intentional way, policies and practices can also be used to undo them, right? And so the question about temporality, I think it's an open question. I think I think that's something that we should really be testing. And I hope that we have some good data and that it shows that we can actually turn things around in a relatively short period of time. That would be my hope. I'll also point to the data that showed that, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, right, there was a sharp uptick in poor health outcomes among Muslim women. And so that's on the other side. But you can imagine that, if toxic environments can quickly lead to, worse outcomes, then you can imagine that perhaps by alleviating toxic environments might also lead to relatively quick health benefits at the population level. So that's my hypothesis, and I'm sticking to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There are so many kind of tough questions coming through the Q&A. Thank you for tackling them. Carmen, you emphasize the ways that policies in the criminal legal system and the immigration system negatively impact Black and Brown people's access to food and cash assistance programs. Are there any policies that have successfully helped connect folks to other types of social welfare programs?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So as I mentioned, for both, immigrant groups and people who are involved in the criminal legal system. So for immigrant groups, I kind of conceptualize these groups as somewhat a similar population with respect to their rights of citizenship. So for people who are not born in this country, they may not have rights to social programs based on their citizenship, at least. And we know that interacts with racism, of course. And for folks who are involved in the criminal legal system, they also lose rights of citizenship, regardless of being born here, as a result of their legal status or criminal status. And so both of these groups experience reduced access to welfare benefits that they may otherwise qualify for. And from my understanding of what programs have begun to reach these folks, I mentioned, so actually before I get there, I want to just clarify that people who have been convicted of drug felonies have a lifetime ban from cash assistance and food assistance, which has huge impacts, as you can imagine, on lots of outcomes, and especially food-related outcomes and health, obviously. So one intervention that has come about in the last 10 years has been the Affordable Care Act. And prior to the Affordable Care Act, folks who are involved in the criminal legal system, primarily men, primarily Black men, brown men, have potentially only had access to healthcare in the jail and prison context. Because in the United States, jails and prisons are the only places where we have a constitutional right to healthcare. And so outside of that, people, especially, like I said, men who've been involved in jail or prison have been traditionally uninsured, but now the Affordable Care Act has changed eligibility, making poorer, lower income men eligible for Medicaid. And we have seen since 2014 in the Medicaid expansion that men who have been to jail and prison, their levels of insuredness has gone up tremendously. So this, we would hope has a really positive impact on all health-related outcomes. And maybe it's a policy that we can think about ways of changing other policies that have blocked access for these groups. But I will add that in the last few years, starting around the time that Trump became president, the enrollment in insurance for men who have been to jail and prison, and I have a paper about this right now, coming under review rather, has dipped back down to almost pre-Affordable Care Act levels, which is pretty striking considering that this was within the year and two before COVID. And now we can only imagine what that's like during COVID and since. So long answer to say the Affordable Care Act has helped, but we think there's reasons to now think that we've gone a little bit back in time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's unfortunate news, but thank you for answering that question. Shiriki, you presented a number of health equity frameworks. What do you think is the top priority that researchers should consider in selecting a health equity framework when they are developing research questions around programs and policies to address nutrition equity?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know that I've thought enough about that. I think it's going to be an issue of match. Depending on the focus of the health equity framework, the types of variables and pathways that they're highlighting will be more or less applicable to different circumstances. And so it has to do with understanding where you would like to end up. So the policy frameworks, for example, analyzing policies for different effects on high or low income women, or women with children or not children, and things like that. So some of those frameworks have broken that down in a way that you could see all the different ways that a policy or a combination of policies could really disadvantage a certain subgroup of the population. So for that, you could pick that. So in a way, it's the same issue of an outcome, but the outcome is a social determinant. So you're looking for a pathway or a conceptual framework that relates to that determinant, as opposed to getting a framework first that deals with the health outcome, which is farther downstream.
Thank you. In the last few minutes, I have one question that I'll ask each of you. It's a big question, so I'll ask each of you to take a minute or two to answer. What do you recommend in terms of future interventions and policy changes? What can those of us who do research in the healthy eating realm do to improve health equity in our work? Tyson, let's start with you.
Sure, Jennifer, would you mind contextualizing that? Are you thinking primarily in terms of policy or what we as scholars can do?
I think, what is your advice to the audience as they're thinking about interventions and policy changes? For example, things related to nutrition and healthy eating research. where should we really be, if we're going to pick one thing to really hone in on and focus to overcome structural racism. From your perspective, what would you recommend that we should all be focusing on?
Yeah, well, I think some of the take homes from this kind of burgeoning literature is that, social conditions and economic conditions and political conditions and living conditions are ultimately health related, right? And so these are the biggest drivers of health. And so I don't know that there's like one lever that one can push. I think the insights that's kind of emerging from the structural racism literature is that this is really multi-sectoral, it's multifaceted, it's multiple levels. And so this is a complex system. And so it's given that there are reciprocal feedbacks, it's highly unlikely that moving one lever is going to lead to, massive shifts, right? And so this is my opinion. But I think that really taking a broad-based approach, and I think that we shouldn't take that as to be, overwhelming. I think this is, this just speaks to, we got ourselves in this situation over many, many decades, centuries, in many different domains. And so it's a complex issue, and I think that requires complex solutions that are multi-sectoral. And so I think it's an all of the above. Many people believe that if you had to choose an area, if you were going to pin me down, many social scientists and others tend to think that residential segregation is a key linchpin that drives a number of other outcomes, including education, opportunities for jobs, opportunities for building wealth, the things, exposures that people are experience, and also access to certain resources, including healthy foods and healthy environments. And so I certainly think that the built environment and the social environment are really key. And so those are the places that I would probably perhaps begin there.
Yeah, thank you. That is such an important point you made, that there are so many upstream drivers. And I think in our nutrition research world, like Shiriki pointed out, this is new in some ways. So linking with folks like you who have that long-standing history in social sciences to take a broad approach. Carmen, what advice do you have for the audience, for those who are seeking to help improve nutrition equity through their research?
Yeah, and in terms of, thinking about sort of like what, how can we sort of capture all the multifaceted and multiple domains of policy and interventions that are existing. So to me, I think that ultimately what these policies, the foundation of these policies is our economic system of capitalism, right? So I wonder if there is room to investigate this from a historical and comparative perspective, to think about the ways that, in the US, we lack a strong social welfare state. And, what does it mean that we are strong on capitalism, high on inequality? How can we be thinking about sort of the culmination and accumulation of all of our policies and their impacts on that relate to structural racism, like inherently? Can we think about it that way? I think that's like very upstream. And I think it's difficult to observe because it is, as one of the comments mentions, like it is sort of like the groundwater. So how do we see it when we live in it? A fish doesn't see the water that it's in, so how do we observe that? And I don't have a great answer to how to do that, but that would be my advice, is to think about it that way.
Thank you. Shiriki?
So I get the last word on
you
this
get the last word.
I think that this is a good time for some strategic planning in the nutrition community. The signs are there that we need to be able to influence the policies that are upstream, the broader policies. So we know that, if not, we're band-aiding far downstream. I think the strategy could include picking some policies in a particular area, like family policy or housing policy. We have these social experiments that have taken place, or policies that would alter something within the criminal justice system, or outside. And then if we could see that that policy looks like it's having a big influence on a particular population, then we will expand our policy systems and environmental change work to the next level and partner with people who know these other social spaces and link our outcomes. I mean, the classic is the moving to opportunity example, where the experiment was housing, but the measures included health. And I think we need to do that. So I can remember when there was none of this PSE stuff going on in nutrition. This field was built mostly by healthy eating research. And it's time to broaden it, but it needs some strategy to figure out how to do it effectively and how to find those other colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you to Carmen, Tyson, and Shiriki. Really, I've just learned so much. I think there's so many new questions that have come out from this. The audience, I'm sure, is you'll probably be getting a lot of emails. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll turn it over to Megan to wrap things up. And thank you to the audience, of course, for listening and joining us.
Yes, thank you. Just to reiterate, HER's thanks to all of you, our wonderful moderator, Jennifer, our panelists, Carmen, Tyson, Shiriki. We really appreciate your presentations and insight you shared with us today. And, healthy eating research has long been a big proponent of interdisciplinary collaborative research teams. I think one thing that really struck me listening to everyone's presentations today, as we're thinking more about finding health and non-health policies and the many upstream factors, is really thinking about even expanding our network to be more interdisciplinary than we've been in the past, and really think about taking the next step there as an easy first step to begin to explore some of these connections. So I want to just take 1 minute in closing to remind you of a couple of logistical reminders as well. So in addition to yesterday's fabulous research presentations and the presentations we heard today, I want to remind everyone that we have additional research projects we are featuring this year in the form of virtual posters. It's the first time we've tried this. They are available to view on our website. Lindsay is going to be putting the link to where you can find them directly in the chat. Please take some time to look at them. Our teams worked really hard to share some new results with you in a new format we're testing out. So we'd love your feedback. And we know there are so many competing demands for your time these days. We really appreciate you sharing some of that precious time today with the HER family and with looking at the posters as well. I want to remind everyone that today's session has been recorded and will be available next week. And we hope to see you at our upcoming sessions tomorrow on food and addiction and Friday on policy. But if not, please be on the lookout for our meeting evaluation. And finally, we hope to be in person again in 2023. But if not, we'll continue to bring you wonderful sessions virtually as much as we can. Thanks so much. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.